Chapter 3, Alexander 3, August 15th, 922,501,024 AD. It was done. It was ready. Alexander was alone, and he wished to be alone no longer. Therefore, he had devised what he believed to be a means of ending his solitude, a means of reuniting with the people of Earth. With his mastery of all things, he had constructed from the void the means to reverse time. It would seem it had been made from nothing at all, but that was not the case. Alexander was privy to the subset of reality through which floods the fundamental materials that of which the universe is composed, the quantum realm. He could see elementary particles swirling in an ocean around him, unattainable due to their high speeds, intangible due to their high energies, and he could capture them and slow them down. He pulled quarks from the ether and fashioned them into protons, and he pulled electrons from thin space and forged neutrons from his protons. Then he constructed hydrogen atoms and forced them to fuse with one another repeatedly to form the materials he needed and supply the energy he would use. He did all this with only his mind, the consciousness of the mechanical being objecting all the while. It would have seemed as though he were encapsulated within a little star to an observer watching him during the process of the construction, with all of the nuclear reactions that he left uncontained generating light and heat byproducts which he allowed to safely escape from places where it might damage his creation. It took him over 1,000 years to complete its construction, not because of any intended hesitation in the creation, but because he had to give the components time to cool down. Despite all of which he was capable of, he was still subjugated by the laws that governed the natural processes of existence. He had to be patient, and so he was. Now the day had finally come. In the shadow of the raging ball of lightning that was Earth, aglow by her incandescent blue flashes, Alexander stood inside of his machine. The day had come at last. His time machine was complete, and he felt satisfied that it would work. "This will not work," sounded the being's voice from deep within him, at the seat of his consciousness. "We will never know until we try," retorted Alexander, essentially talking to himself in his head. "But we do know," the being said. Alexander paused. He was hopeful that it would work, and in his mind he had, with the passing of time, bolstered that hope and elevated it to a state of confidence of which it was undeserving. He knew this, but he was human in his core and thus thrived on belief in lieu of assurances. He had held some notion, in spite of his confidence, that failure was an outcome all too likely, but he ignored any path of thought which might have led him to reconsider, remaining focused all the while on his objective, for Alexander was alone. "You know what will happen," the being said, urging in its mechanical way for him to stop. "You know, and yet you remain steadfast on your quest." "There are none that live here anymore," Alexander reasoned. "None that stand to suffer." "Yes," it said, "but there are others elsewhere, others who will perish. You will have their deaths on your conscience." Alexander remained paused, afloat in his craft, the sun rising over the misty, lightning-wrought horizon of Earth far below him. He hesitated. He had waited all this time. Now it was ready, and he hesitated. "Have you nothing to say for yourself?" Alexander, his form reimagined, having subtly changed with the ages, a taller, more symmetrical and idyllic version of his former, said in defense, "It is not known with certainty that they will die. What we are doing has no precedence. There are variable outcomes in which everything survives." "Master," it said, "the projected outcomes you refer to are few and reliant on the control over processes over which you have no influence, contingent on very unlikely conditions. Are you really willing to risk the destruction of the universe to satisfy your desire for companionship?" Alexander had a very human thought, having decided that wrestling the conundrum was useless. He was going to do it. He was going to take his chances and activate his machine. He remained paused a while longer, lamenting perhaps for the souls of all the creatures of the universe, listening to the sounds they made skittering about in futility throughout the worlds of the cosmos. Why not wait until life is extinguished throughout the universe before you test your device? Further reasoned the monotone, unfeeling voice of the being, perhaps truly Alexander's conscience at work, Why not wait until it is known that none shall perish by your folly?" "I have been patient long enough," Alexander said. "I want to go home, and this is the only way." "Have you been patient long enough, master?" it urged. "Have you no compassion?" "I am alone. Am I also then alone in deserving not that which I desire?" he said. "Why should I suffer alone for all eternity when I have the means to end my condemnation?" "You are not alone, master," it said. "You are never alone." "No," he said aloud, his first utterance since the time of his rebirth, and he activated his machine. Lyelin 11.1, April 24th, 1970 AD. His love had bid him walk until the light should fade, and then farther still, so he had walked headlong into the depths. His love had bid him submerge without concern and let the water overtake him, that he would know her again. So he, instead of dying, breathed the water, for he would see her again. No means of death could touch him, he knew, while he held fast this notion. She had long ago told him it was so, and so he knew. So Hemhut was content to wait in the watery abyss, where he had walked and walked until he was so deep that the light had faded, and then walked and walked until he was deeper still. He descended as instructed, forever downward until the planting of his next footstep would see him no longer descending but rising. He had walked until he was at the deepest point of the Atlantic Ocean along his ever forward-moving path that he could have reached while never taking a step that would see him an inch closer to breaching the surface. When he had reached his destination, he'd stopped, and now he waited. The ocean floor had overtaken him as the centuries had passed, concealing him under a mount of silt and sediment, and he was home to several families of various small sea creatures that had been battling for dominion over the heat of his body for some thousands of their generations. He, content in his abysmal tomb, waited patiently for his love to beckon him. He, as instructed, did not but follow her word and await her return. His vigil would not be in vain. She had said it was so, and so it would be. The day would come that he would hear her voice again. Then he would depart from his statuesque state, and the mound would crumble behind him and slough from his 10-foot-tall beast of a form as he would walk again. Only he would, instead of walking from her, then walk toward her, and he would end his solitude. That day was today. For miles and miles away, through the current and over the crash of ocean, and over the rattle of wind and commotion of life and nature, could be heard the quiet breaths of Justine Henderson. She was asleep, and she was dreaming, and something in her had been triggered. As she shifted her body in her sleep, a change began. An egg had descended from her ovaries deep inside, and there was a release of chemicals from within into her bloodstream. From inside his waterlogged casket, Hemhut heard the change in her voice, a subtle, nearly inaudible hum from her larynx, hidden in the sound of her breathing. The obedient giant opened its eyes. She had come. In a sudden burst, the mound erupted and crumbled into a swirling cloud of dust in the deep, pitch-black water, and Hemhut emerged, aimed directly for the sound of her voice, and began walking, ready to follow his next set of instructions that he'd been waiting centuries to execute. A week's journey away, Justine Henderson roused with a start. She was 12 and had been blind since she was 8, yet she had awakened seeing things, only she wasn't seeing through her own eyes. It seemed she was seeing through other people's eyes. Though she would not figure this out until one of the caregivers at her boarding school came rushing to her room, having heard her waking cries of distress. When she saw herself through his eyes and locked her blind eyes in line of sight with his, that was when she figured out what was happening. But what was she seeing elsewhere? It was all the present, all at once, from all eyes on earth. She started crying, and wailed that she was scared and didn't know what was happening to her. Her caretaker shushed her, embracing her and consoling her with his best effort, offering only an unassuring claim that everything would be all right. Her father was contacted and arrived within the day. Her pediatrician agreed to see her without delay, and was amazed by just how authentic the girl's newfound ability to see through all eyes but her own seemed to be. She tested it over and over, from bedside and from rooms away, and it seemed to her that Justine, by some miracle, did appear genuinely capable of that which she claimed. Justine even surprised her by telling her an almost verbatim recitation of what she'd written while updating her patient profile, which she'd done privately in her office just moments before returning to the examination room, luckily having not forgotten how to read these 4 years blind. She, with all of her medical expertise and experience, her father, as well as all the other staffers present who'd caught wind of it and hadn't been immediately dismissive, were baffled and stunned, but mostly in awe. The world was changing. Just the year before, mankind had walked on the moon for the first time. Now a blind girl was seeing through her neighbor's eyes. It was a strange new world. There was nothing to be done for it. There was nothing medicine could do for her, but the doctor referred her to a specialist anyway. The field of neurology was budding, however primitive in its infancy it was, and it was agreed that if any understanding of her condition was to be obtained, it would be by way of examining her brain. So an appointment was set up. Justine would never make it to that appointment. After staying home for a few days, seeking some level of normalcy, Justine asked if she could go back to school the next day. She thought that maybe being around the other blind kids might put her at ease. At least she wouldn't be flooded by so many eyes in one place as she now found most everywhere there were people. Plus, she was excited to tell her friends about her new ability. She could now see almost a full 3 seconds into the future, and was starting in her mind to piece this together as well. But as it was in most cases hardly distinguishable from the 3 seconds preceding it, she would never fully come to grips with its grandness in time. Not before she ceased to be herself. Not before she would be replaced by Lila. She returned to St. Mary's boarding school for the blind, welcome back, already a legend in her own respects. For word had already spread through the school of the strange change in her, and whispers abounded as she paraded down the hall, happy to get back to some measure of her former normal. Her father rented a room at a nearby motel for the night so that he could be readily available for her, and insisted that she have him notified immediately should she have any need for him. She thrilled her roommates that night with stories of what people known to them were doing at the moment, and other notable whimsies she thought worth sharing. It seemed the world had opened to her. The world had purged its secrets into her lap, and she divulged freely to her blind friends simple wonders unknown to them or her until then. It was all very comforting, and for the first time since waking with her new sight, she felt okay and somewhat normal. She went to sleep that night smiling. She was becoming more practiced at tuning out the disquiet of the world, shutting her eyes to all that stay open as she rested, and managed to sleep soundly that night for the first time in days. She was getting used to it. She would be all right. Miles and miles away, Hemhut breached the water and walked out onto the land, the footfalls of his massive form leaving deep depressions in the soft sand which abruptly filled with water as the waves swathed. He followed the sweetness of her voice like a beacon. His love lived. She had returned. Oh, the joy that awaited him, for he would soon be at her side.